In this video, we are going to use Substance Alchemist to create this wood floor material using this bitmap. I will show you how to process this non-square image and use bitmap to material to produce the material outputs. We will then use some procedural layers to create the parquet pattern and the wood finish. Okay, so before we actually get started, let's make sure we're on the same page and have a similar project set up. So what I'm going to do is come over here to my viewer settings, and I'm going to make sure that my global parameters output resolution is set to 2048 by 2048. Here you can see that I'm using the plane mesh, and for the environment, I'm using glazed patio. So I'll close up my viewer settings, and now I'm going to just simply drag and drop the TIFF file here into the 3D view. Now, in the material creation template, I'm going to make sure that I first choose Use as Bitmap. So what we're going to do first, before we jump right into bitmap to materials, we're going to do a little pre-processing on this image. So that's why I'm using the Use as Bitmap option. So we'll click OK, and you'll notice that here in my layer stack, the import image is added. So I'm going to just click on this to view the properties, and you'll notice that the output usage is set to this option called Scan 1. Since right now we're not really working on our material, I think what I'm going to do is just jump over here to my 2D view so we can see the image. And here at the bottom of the view, we can see all these channels, and we want to make sure that we have Scan 1 selected. So again, output usage set to Scan 1, and here in the viewer I'm using Scan 1. Also here you can see that the resolution for this image is set to 3024 by 4032. This is the original source resolution from the image that I imported into Substance Alchemist. And as you can see, it's a non-square image. So what I want to do, since I'm working with this non-square data, is I want to do, like I said, a little pre-processing to this image before we feed the data into bitmap to material. So the first step that I need to do is I need to set an area of this image that I want to crop to, because we want to convert this non-square image to a square image. So here in my layer stack where I have add a layer, this is my filter option. I can click this here, and I'm going to use the option for crop. So left click, and you can see that I'm adding the crop tool here to my layer stack. And already we start to see that the image has been cropped here to this square ratio based on the input size. And the input size here is 4096 by 4096. Now, we do want to make an adjustment to this. I want to use as the input size coming into the crop the original source dimensions. So just a tip to get back to that in case you didn't remember what the original resolution was is you can come over here to your layer stack, and I can just disable this layer by clicking this eye icon. So I'm just going to click this here, and you can see that it's going to disable the layer, and that takes me back here to the layer below it, which is the import image, and there again I can see that original source resolution. Now what I want to do is just copy this information here to the input size. So what we're going to do is type in 3024, and then for the Y, we're going to type in 4032, and that's going to be the resolution that I have set. So I'll hit enter just to lock that in. Now I want to come back here to my layer, and I want to activate this crop. I'll just toggle this eye icon, which is going to just reactivate this layer. So now we are cropping this here to a square image, but I'm taking into consideration the original resolution of the input size of my import image. Now I have my manipulator here in my 2D view, and I can actually move this around. So for example, I can see I have this little blemish here in my image. This is probably going to cause some problems when I go to do tiling, so I might just want to make sure I move that up out of the way. All right, so the next thing I want to do is check the tiling of this image. So to do that, I can tap the T key on the keyboard, and now I can start to see the tile. And already I can see some issues with this image. We have some pretty wide discrepancy between the balance of light and darkness here in the tonal value of this image. So notice here we have like this little dark area. Over here in this corner it gets a little lighter, it's lighter here, and so on. So we have this discrepancy between this dark and light area, and you can see that this is obviously causing a problem here in our tile where this dark value matches up with this light value. So we want to fix this, and we can do that by simply using the equalizer filter here in Substance Alchemist. So once again, I'm going to come over to my layer stack and click the Add Layer button. And then I'm just going to use the equalizer. So come down here towards the bottom, and I'm going to left click on equalizer, and that's going to add that here to my layer stack. already you can see once that's processed, it does a pretty good job of balancing or equalizing the light and dark values here in that image. We also have this radius setting, and I can make a few extra tweaks to that. So you can see I'm just going to drop it a little bit just to further balance that out. Okay, so we've gone this far, and so far all we've done really is we've just imported our image, we've done a crop, and then we've ran an equalizer for our tonal range. But we haven't actually ran bitmap to material yet. So here, if I activate my 3D, 2D split view, you can see, well, in our 3D view, we don't actually have a material at all. We just have this 2D image. So now what we're going to do is we're going to apply bitmap to material. So once again, we're going to come over to add a layer. And you can see here towards the top, we have bitmap to material. I'm going to left click to add bitmap to material to my layer stack. And already here in our 3D view, we start to get what looks like a material. So I can rotate around my view. Also, I'm going to want to move my environment. So that's holding down the shift key and the right mouse button and moving left to right. And you can see I can rotate my environment. So now we're already starting to get some information or a material. Now in our 2D view, and here towards the bottom, we have our channels for our material. So here, if I click base color, we're viewing the base color. And if I click normal, you can see that by using bitmap to material, a normal map has been generated for us. Same thing with our roughness, as well as our height and our ambient occlusion. Let's jump back over to height for now, and we can start to make some changes. So for example here, I can come over to my height, and this is where I can start to play around with some of my height details, scale settings for large, medium, and small shapes. Now, before I get into actually tweaking these height values, I want to talk a little bit about the actual displacement shader. So over here in the 3D view, I'm going to click this displacement icon, and here you can see that I have this displacement amplitude setting as well as a quality. Now, by default, I believe the quality is set pretty low, so I'm going to set this all the way up to a value of 1, just make sure I have maximum quality. And then I'm going to set this displacement amplitude. Now, for this video, I am just using an arbitrary value. And where I'm coming up with this number is I want this number to represent the overall kind of scale value that I would actually be using in, say, my application where I'm going to be rendering this material. So that could be maybe something like Unity, Unreal Engine, or maybe I'm using V-Ray in 3ds Max. So either way, I'm just trying to take this value and have it represent the scale that I will be using in my actual rendering software. And then once I have this value, when I set things like my surface scale, my height, as well as my large, medium, small detail, it's all going to be relative to what I have for this displacement amplitude. Now also in this case, since it's just an image that I found online, I don't actually know what the surface scale is. So I'm going to leave this at 100 centimeters. And I'm going to take a look at this actual plane that I have, and I know this is 100 units by 100 units. So I'm going to go just with that type of scale setup here as I work in Substance Alchemist. Now for my height scale, I am going to come into here, and I'm going to set this to a value of 0.04, and I'll hit enter just to lock that value in. So now if I zoom in, you can see that we have basically lowered that overall height scale by using the value here for what this texture will represent, and not so much by the display amplitude here inside of Substance Alchemist. All right, so now that I've done that, I'm also going to take a look at playing around with some of the scale for my details. So for example, I can move this slider here, and I can decrease some of these large details. Same thing with the medium details as well. So you can see I can dial this up and down. I think I'm going to move this value up a little bit and then also increase the small detail scale as well. Now that I have this in place, also important to constantly be checking your environment. So again, using the shift right mouse button left to right just to see how this actual height is going to affect the overall light as it reflects off the surface. All right, so again, we could jump back to things like my roughness map, and I have control over that here as well. However, I'm not actually going to tweak these controls specifically using bitmap to material. We will rely on other filters within Substance Alchemist to take care of that. Now again, back over here at my base color, I have my base color value, and here we have my normal, which my normal is actually being generated based on the information I have here from my height. And again, we can tweak these values later with other filters in our stack. Let's take a look now at our tiling once again now that we have a material to work with. So here, just to kind of view this in my 2D view, I'll hit the T key on my keyboard, and I'm going to zoom into the view. And if I look over here in this corner, sure enough, we're still having some issues here with seams because, well, we haven't actually done anything to the tiling yet. So you can see that I have this seam here, and we're going to fix that right now. And we can do that by using our tiling filter. So here, once more, I'm going to come over to Add Layer. I'm going to start to type in tiling, and you can see here that we have this tiling filter. So I'm going to left click on this tiling option, and it's going to add this filter here to my layer stack. And you can see here that it provides this manipulator. Now I can left click and drag this manipulator around. I can also do some different types of transform operations. So for example, if I move my mouse outside of the transform widget, I can left click and drag to rotate here. So I'm just going to square this back up here. I can also come over to the side of the widget, and I can make transformation scale changes as well. So one of the things, though, that I really want to bring your attention to is, again, this edge. So I'm going to zoom in here to the edge. And if we look at the properties for the tiling, we have this option called Detect Edges. Now, it's a bit hard to see the seam here. So one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over here to my height channel. And you can see that we have this seam. This is like a cut edge to create a seamless representation of this image. Now, if I come over here to this threshold and I start to lower this, you can see what happens here is that this cut line is actually being distorted. And that is what this Detect Edges is doing. So for example, if I turn this off, you can see that we get a very nice straight cut line. But if I want to have something that is a bit harder to tell that we have this cut line, and I want something that's a bit more organic, I can enable Detect Edges, and then I can control this distortion here based on my threshold value. So you can see what this is doing is it takes a look at these underlying shapes and forms, and it distorts that line, again, trying to follow these shapes and forms. Now, we can also play around with our grid resolution. So if I increase this grid resolution, you can see that we start to get a bit more displacement or finer detail here within that cut line. And then if we decrease it, you can see that we start to get, larger distorted shapes. So in my case here, I think I'm just going to leave this at a value of 9. Now we do have this distorted kind of cut line. Again, that's going to make it a bit harder to see where we have that tile, but we still see this line. It's very, very distinct. So now what we would want to do is just come over here to our blur option, and you can see I can increase my blur and essentially just make that line completely disappear. Now it goes to 2 by default, but I can come into here and I can overdrive this. So for example, if I type 4 and hit enter, again, like I said, I can overdrive that a bit. But I think what I'll do is maybe split the difference and just use a value of 3. So now I can just zoom out, and you can see that we now have a seamless image. And like I said, I can always go back and start to play around here and move this transform widget. Let's go back here to our base color, and here, if you see, if I start to move this threshold, again, like I said, you can see that distorted edge because I have Detect Edges enabled. Now, you would also use this transform manipulator if you needed to align some patterns. Like, for example, if I needed to line up any of the wood grain, I could rotate or scale the transform manipulator to make sure that any patterns line up specifically in my tile. Okay, so the next thing that I want to start to take a look at is some repeating patterns that I might have. So I'm going to come over here to my 3D view, and I'm going to take a look at my tiling. So right now it's set to 2 by 2. And this is just the display tiling here in my 3D view. I'm going to set this to a 1 by 1 because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to visualize, like I said, I have this plane which I know is 100 units by 100 units, and I'm going to visualize this texture applied as this single unit. Now, when I come back over to my tile, I can actually increase the tiling here within the texture or the channels themselves. So what I'm going to do is just take my tile and I'm going to set this to a value of 2. So I'm basically going to bake in this tile to the texture at this stage. So now if I zoom in here, I can now get a better look at some of these patterns that are going to be repeating here within this image. So for example, right here in the dead center of my image, I have this line. You can see this little faint kind of white line. So here, I'll zoom in really close. You can see it here. And we need to get rid of that guy because it's causing me some repeating pattern issues. So to do that, we can use the clone patch filter. So here again, we're going to come over to our layer stack. We're going to click Add Layer, and then I'm going to use the clone patch. So now that the clone patch has been added here to my stack, what I'm going to do is just come over here to the 2D view. I can hold down the V key and left click to set my source sample area. So what I'm going to do, again, like I said, hold down V, and I'm just going to left click maybe right here in this area. And that sets my source to clone from. I can also come up here to the top of the UI and change the brush size to a bit larger size. And now what I can do is just come over here into the 2D view and just simply start to draw a stroke here to kind of paint this out. So we're going to do this. I also want to make sure I get here towards the top. Now, when I take the mouse and just move it out of the 2D view, you can see that we can now visualize the texture itself. So here we can see this white area denotes where the stroke has taken place. And we also have some settings for this as well, like our threshold. So what I'm going to do is just come over here and I can start to move this threshold. So you'll notice that if you look at this here, let's actually take a look maybe at the height channel here. And I start to move my threshold, you can see in this view the edges that we have. So we also have the capability to work with that detect edges. So again, it's following the underlying shape and form. It's breaking up that brush stroke edge so that it's more organic and it blends in a lot better. I still have a bit of a hard edge, so no problem. We know we can increase that blur value and essentially just make that edge of that brush completely disappear. We also have our grid resolution and, like I said, our threshold. Same settings that I just covered here in the tiling. So let's jump back over to our base color and take a look. So we've taken care of that. However, I have a little bit of another spot here as well as here that I'd like to get rid of. Now, the clone patch, you need to think of that as a single operation. So we've done that once. We can't just continue to add strokes to that because it's going to change the work that we've already done. So what I need to do is come over to add layer, and then I'm going to add a clone patch one more time. So think of each stroke that you want to add or each item that you want to patch out. You need to do that with a separate clone patch operation. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's start with a source sample. So hold down V and left click an area. And what I want to do is just paint this guy out here. So I'm going to come in and just kind of paint this guy out. And then I'm going to come over and I'm going to continue that stroke here. Now I can come back over to my threshold and I can start to play around with this. Let's change my grid resolution. So you can see here what I'm doing is I'm changing these values between the different clone patches to get, varied results. And what this is essentially doing is like basically taking parts of the image that I'm cloning and I'm making little tile sections within that. And it really helps to break up the image and making this a little harder to gauge where some of these repeating patterns are appearing. Now I notice I still have a few here, these little light areas, but I'm not so much worried about that because I know I'm going to be adding some extra filters on top that's really going to hide that. But just to drive home the example, let's do one more. So we'll come in and do a clone patch. I do want to get rid of just some of this, so I'm going to hold down V, sample an area, and then I'm going to come in and maybe just paint in that section there like that. All right, and then like I said, I can always go back and just play around here with my threshold. I'm going to change that grid resolution, make this a little bit larger, increase that blur a little bit, and there we go. So we start to break that up quite a bit. So here you can see this is the result that we have thus far in our 3D view. This is our entire material. Again, because Substance is always working across multiple channels, all of the filters we're adding propagates over to all the channels that we have thus far. Now that we have all this in place, I want to start taking a look at maybe doing some image adjustments here. So one of the things I want to do on top of this is probably come in and add a color variation. So I'm going to add a color variation because right now the color is just really bland. I just want to vary this up a bit. So first thing I'm going to do, we've added color variation. It's going to do a quick little process here. And the color count set to 10. We don't really want that. I'm just going to set it to a value of 2. And if I look at the color option, because I set this to a value of 2, I have 2 input colors. Of course, I could, make more or less if I want to, but I'm going to leave this at a value of 2. So for color 1, I can come into here and I can click this color button. And what that's going to do is launch the color picker. And I'm going to choose one of these colors that I have selected and then click OK. And it's going to apply that color. Now I'm going to use color 2. This is just going to give me a little bit of a variation. I'm going to choose the same color, except this time I'm just going to make it just a little bit lighter, and then we'll click OK here. So now this is the value that I'm getting. We can also enable here this custom color variation, and if we take a look at the controls for this, I now have the capability to vary this based on hue, chroma, and luma. So one of the things I'll do here, this has got a little bit of noise in it, so if I just drop this luma value a bit, you'll see what this does is it just kind of smooths out the result, and it gives me, a little bit more of a, I guess, a stylized kind of look. So I might go with something like that. It might be a little too much. So here, actually, let me set this to a value of around 0.82. All right, so that's what I'm going to go with here. Now, the next thing I want to do on top of this is add an adjustment. So I'm going to hit my add layer, and I'm going to add an adjustment layer on top. And this lets me do a lot of adjustments to each one of the channels that I've been working on here in my layer stack. So for example, if we come over here to our base color diffuse, I'm going to do a post sharpen intensity value. So we're going to sharpen that base color just a bit. Also notice if I wanted to introduce some kind of tiling within the image themselves, within the channels themselves, I could do that here as well. I'm not going to because we've already actually done that way back in our tiling operation about middle of my layer stack. I can also do a reapply color. I can play around with some things like here, let's increase this contrast, maybe drop the luminosity down a little bit and so on. So a little bit of image adjustment there. And I can feather that back by just lowering that adjustment intensity if I like. Okay, so something else to take a look at. If we come over to our roughness, I could come into my roughness here, and this is where I can start to dial this up and down here if I need to. So we can do that. We can increase our contrast a little bit. So I'm actually going to increase the contrast. So now you can see we're starting to pull out some of that detail. But I'm going to leave the intensity value here. Let me just set that to 0, because like I said, I'm going to use a filter later that's really going to kind of handle this roughness setting. Now, the next thing I want to take a look at is maybe my ambient occlusion. So we really don't see much here. So what I can do is come over to my ambient occlusion value, and there's an option here that says recompute AO from new height. And I want to use this option. So watch what happens here when I enable this value. It's going to recompute my AO. And so now I get this whole new AO map that's been recomputed based on the height adjustments I've been making here. Now I can go in and make some actual fine-tune adjustments, such as maybe lower my depth here. It's probably a little too intense, and then I can adjust that spread here a bit. So maybe we'll try something like maybe this for now. Okay, so something else we could do the same thing with the normal. We can increase our normal intensity. So right now it's pretty low, but I can drive this up a bit. So here you can see it's almost non-existent, but I'm just going to drive it a little bit. Actually here, what I'm going to do is set this to 0.04. And I'll leave it like that. So because I don't want it to too high, but it is good that you can use this adjustment layer to make these minute little changes like this. All right, so now that we have this in place, we've got this kind of base wood. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to stack some procedural effects on top of it. So I'm not really too concerned with my 2D view right now, so I'm going to jump over here to my 3D view. And I'm actually going to come over here to the interface, and I'm going to click on this filter button. So this is just another way that you can access filters within Substance Alchemist. You can also hit the space bar, similar to what you can do in Substance Designer, and add filters this way as well. So you don't have to constantly be mousing over here to the layer stack and clicking add layer. You can simply hit the space bar or use the filters here from the left side of the UI. Now what I'm going to do is jump over here to this generator. And this is a pretty good view if you're new to Substance Alchemist. It just kind of lets you see the filters divided up into the different categories they represent, and it kind of just helps you learn the type of tools that are available to you. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this parquet pattern. So I'm just going to left click and just drag that into my 3D view, and what it's going to do is add that filter here to the top of my layer stack. And we're going to add a little wood pattern here. Now, there's a bunch of different pattern types you can see here. I'm going to start with English, and I'm going to set my X amount to a value of 2 and my Y amount to a value of, let's say, let's do 8. All right, so we'll do this. Now, one problem right off the bat is the wood grain that I have is basically going in the wrong direction. I need to rotate this by 90 degrees. And I can do that by simply dropping back over to my layer stack here and clicking on tiling. And I can rotate the manipulator. However, we have a nice little shortcut here. So I'm just going to rotate it by 90 degrees by clicking the 90-degree rotate button. And you can see that it recomputes up the layer stack. Let's go back and maximize our 3D view. And here you can see that the wood grain is now placed in the right direction here. Okay, so let's go back to that parquet pattern and let's look at some of the options we have. So for example, I can increase or decrease here this plank contrast. So if we want to have, a floor that looks more like this, I do kind of like a little bit of this variation, so I think I'm going to leave that here. We can also play around with things like our bevel intensity, so you can see some of the changes we make. We actually break this off into the bevel X and Y distance and so on. So a lot of different options to really dial in this effect to get exactly what you want. Now also here for the pattern type, we can change this as well. So for example, if I want to do like say square basket, I can do this. If I want to go to like say a herringbone pattern, I can do that as well, and so on. And now we can visualize the tile here in our 3D view by simply jumping over to our tiling parameter, and I'm going to set this to a 2x2 tile. So this is the full result that I'm getting. And again, I can switch this around to my pattern types at any time. So let's just stick with this for now. And let's just continue to kind of play around and see what we get. Something else, like I said, I can do at any time is I can jump back over here to my color variation, and I can make changes. I could jump over to maybe my adjustment layer, and let's see, let's increase that contrast a little bit more. Okay, so I want to just bring out a little bit more color, and then I'll just maybe darken that just slightly by just dropping the luminosity there. All right, so that's kind of more of the finish I'm kind of looking for. Now, speaking of finish, we want to actually add maybe a bit of varnish to this wood, and we can do that by simply using our wood finish filter as part of our finish filters here. So what I'm going to do is left click, same song and dance here, left click, drag and drop wood finish into my 3D view. It's going to add it here to the top of the layer stack, and then I'm going to go in and just tweak some of the parameters. So by default, finish type is natural, but I want to set this to a varnish. Now I need to move my environment light around. So again, that's shift, right mouse button, left to right. So we can kind of move this around a bit. And so now we can get a real idea of how this light is going to be interacting here with this roughness information that we're working with. We also have parameters for this varnish. So if I expose these parameters, I can do things like play around with that roughness intensity value here. So I'm going to drop that to around maybe 0.14. I can also play around with just the overall kind of roughness intensity, as well as the normal intensity here for the fibers, as well as the orientation for these normal fibers. And then, of course, we have the fiber contrast here, as well as the roughness intensity, which we've already kind of tweaked. So now that we have this is basically going to finish out the material that I wanted to create, this little wood pattern here. And this is the layer stack that we use to produce this effect. So you can see that what we've done here in this process is we started by importing an image, then we cropped the image, we balanced it with an equalizer, we ran bitmap to material to create our material, then we tiled, we used clone patch to do a little cleanup to kind of get rid of some of those repeating patterns we were seeing, and then we adjusted our color by using color variation adjustment. We applied a procedural wood pattern using our parquet pattern filter. And then lastly, we added a nice little wood varnish here by using a wood finish filter. So now that this is done, I'm going to come over to my layer stack and I'm going to save this material. And this material name, I'm just going to call this, call it wood, let's see, parquet. And then we'll save this here. And that is going to save this material. Actually, I already have this in place, but I'm just saving a different version here. And it's going to save it to the collection that I have. In my case, it's just my little demo collection I started for this video. Now, if I want to, I can start to make changes to this. So let's say I want to make a variation to this. Let's jump back over here to our parquet pattern, and let's maybe switch this here to the herringbone. And so we're going to let this recompute my layer stack. And so that'll take just a moment here to kind of recompute all these steps that we have. All right, so now that I have this guy, this is going to be like a new variation of this. So I'm going to come over to the Save button. I'm going to Shift and left click, and then I'm going to choose Save As. This is going to let me create a new variation of this. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to call this wood underscore herringbone. And then we'll save. And like I said, I can continue making just a bunch of different variations and saving those here to my collection. So that's going to close out this video. Join me in the next video, and we're going to walk through the process of exporting our textures out of Substance Alchemist.